Welcome to biology as we continue our conversation about biomolecules. We learned the other day that our biomolecules are these chemical compounds that are formed within the body. And we learned that we have carbohydrates, we have lipids, we have amino acids, and we have nucleic acids. Those are our four biomolecules. And so now we're going to look at each one uh, kind of individually to deepen our understanding and learn how they are connected. And so, just real quick at the top here, refresher on the learning target. And if you're reading this learning target, we've kind of introduced part of it already. And really, that this second part is right here today. So, again, looking at it, so overall, explain how molecules are made and used in cells. So we're going to continue that conversation. But when you look at the subtarget, construct and revise an explanation based on evidence for how carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen from sugar molecules may combine with other elements to form amino acids and other large carbon-based molecules. And that's really referring to the biomolecules. So again, we have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen from sugar. And when we talk about carbohydrates, and honestly, this is something that took me forever to connect in my brain, but carbohydrates are sugar and sugar are carbohydrates. And so one is really just a more common, like, user friendly term, right? Sugar, where carbohydrates is a more of a technical term, but both that we hear kind of frequently and used in different contexts. But really, when we look at the word carbohydrate, carbo is related to the carbon that is the essence. That's the really the foundation of a carbohydrate or a sugar is carbon, and then it has what's called these hydroxyl groups, and so then we refer to it as hydrate as we're talking about the whole compound. And the hydroxyl is going to be hydrogen, oxygen together. So really, carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, carbohydrates, and that's where that name comes from. Is the combination of that. And so then again, our focus: how are these basically these sugar molecules coming into our body, and how are they being used, and what is their purpose, and then if really we're looking, how can they help build some of the other biomolecules. Okay, so keeping that in mind, that's our goal. We want to be deepening our understanding with this. So first, I included this video, and I want you to watch it. It is so much more detailed than what you need to know. But the reason why I included it is because um, I think it really does give a really good overview of, as it labeled here, carbohydrate metabolism. And so metabolism, just in short, we don't need to talk a whole lot about metabolism, but it really is the breaking down of food. It usually, in a sense, carbohydrates specifically, because you can metabolize other things, and then using that to create energy and to break bonds apart and so forth. So the metabolism really is getting energy throughout the body. And so this is specifically about how our body breaks down and uses carbohydrates. And so what we're going to learn is carbohydrates are very important, and in particular, glucose. Okay, so go ahead and watch this. It's not terribly long, but it really is going to give you a very clear overview of how your body takes in food and produces energy, and what all goes into that, because it's a lot. So um, watch that. That's a very good overview first. Then I have some more notes. These would be the notes that I recommend you take and you format the way that you want, whether it's on paper or in a notebook, or on the computer. But really, can you pull out the important information? Can you summarize it? That's part of the learning process. So I really recommend you do your best to take notes. So first, we have really two categories. So take notes on simple sugars and complex sugars. And so there's two different categories. And so you can call them simple carbohydrates or complex carbohydrates, but really they're more commonly referred to as simple sugar or complex sugars. So starting with simple sugars, there's really two categories. And then within those categories, we have a few different chemical structures that probably you've heard of before. So we have monosaccharides. And maybe I'll blow this up. Oh, that looks nice. Okay, we have monosaccharides. And with those, it's glucose, fructose, and galactose. And again, I'd be highly surprised if you haven't heard of glucose. But glucose is one of the most common, it's most abundant. And as I stated just earlier, and as we look at that video that you just watched, it is by far the most important form of the sugar that we're going to be using in our bodies. But then you have fructose, which some of you are like, fructose. Yeah, high fructose corn syrup is a common part of a synthetic diet, if you will, or artificial diet. And so fructose is commonly used. And when you look at these, you might be like, well, what's the difference between glucose and fructose and galactose? They look kind of similar. And really the only difference is they all have a carbon, what's called a carbon ring. So we've got these little connecting points are carbons, and they're not labeled because carbon is so abundant. And so really the difference is you might notice the shape is a little different. Okay, so fructose has a different amount of carbon, and so we see that the oxygen is in a different location. Okay, we then see that some of the branches that I'll call them, these are the hydroxyl groups coming off are in different locations. Glucose here has additional hydrogens in different places by themselves. That's actually very important as you're looking at that. Okay. And so, really, there's not a lot different, but there's enough where our body will treat them differently. Our body will be able to use these compounds differently. And that's pretty important for us. So then, here's some common things where these are found: glucose, potatoes, bread, certain cereals, rice and beans. Okay, and then fructose, as you might guess, is more fruit based. So you got agave and apple and pear and mango, honey. Okay, galactose is in figs, milk, papaya beans, watermelon, tomatoes, and then so that's a little summary of the monosaccharides. But then we have disaccharides. So the disaccharides you'll see are actually a combination. So that's where the di comes in. There's two of the monosaccharides together. So sucrose, which maybe you've heard of before, right? That's kind of our sugar, our table sugar that we use. It's often lemonade, maple syrup, soft drinks. But sucrose is a combination of glucose and fructose together. And you can see here, they're combined on this oxygen compound. And again, that would be right here. Okay, glucose loses a hydrogen in order to form this bond with fructose. Okay, then there's lactose. Maybe you've heard of people who are lactose intolerant. Tends to be our perception of people who can't drink milk and different things like that, and that's due to the body's struggle to effectively break this apart. And so then we can't metabolize it. And then the result is an upset stomach. and so it can be quite unpleasant, right? So uh, that's what it is, and again, it's simply connected here on an oxygen bond between galactose and glucose, and uh, just by combining those two, the body struggles to break it apart for some. And so again, very interesting how the chemistry of these molecules is very important for our metabolism and in how our body reacts to them. So again, with disaccharides, we have sucrose, maltose, which is a lot more rare. It's due to fermentation, as you can see here, and it is not usually found in high qualities. Can be found in bread. Uh, Yeah. Okay. Then lactose, again, milk, yogurt, pudding, in some cases, beer and whey, like whey protein and instant coffee. There you go. So uh, you can hopefully see the difference. And later in the activity, I'm going to ask you to compare monosaccharides to disaccharides. And really, what I'm hoping you kind of figure out or see is like, okay, well, how healthy would I call these ones, and how healthy would you look at and say that these are? So, um, and there's a reason for that. And I want you to think about the reason. And again, I think the question is worded: what is it about the chemical structure that might make monosaccharides healthier than disaccharides? Okay, so when you look at this, which one would be easier for your body to use? And that's going to be a big part of that. Okay, so then continuing on, I added just a few more notes about glucose because it really is the most important form of carbohydrate. It's the one our body can use the easiest and the best. So glucose is the most important. It has a chemical formula of CHO, but C6H12O6. And then a little explanation what that means. And again, the reason I'm pointing that out, even though we've looked at it a few times now already, is that there's only three elements that make up these carbohydrates, but the way they are formed and the way they're shaped is very important. Their structure. Then a little bit about glucose in the body. Insulin, right? If you've learned about diabetes and so forth, it's depending. It's kind of the struggle with this insulin portion, but insulin helps glucose enter the body cell to be used for energy. So insulin is very important. So that's kind of a side note. But then glucose, here's thinking about the carbohydrates, enters the body's cells to be used for energy. It really will go throughout every single cell in your body to make sure that they have energy and they can continue to thrive. And that is through the bloodstream, just so if you're wondering how that works. Glucose then is broken apart in each cell's cytoplasm and mitochondria to release carbon dioxide, water, and energy. So they get broken apart. That's the metabolism, and that actually occurs within the cells, and the mitochondria is a big piece of that. Now, side note, okay, release of carbon dioxide and water. I challenge you to think about, how does our body get rid of carbon dioxide and water? Okay, we actually we will exhale that. So our breathing, our exhaling, is a result of this glucose being broken down uh, from all of our cells. And then our lungs are obviously a big part of that as well, but that is a chemical reaction that occurs every time we're breathing. And then the result is the energy is the positive thing that our cells can take. So now it is possible to consume too much glucose, right? Now we start thinking, okay, well, what does this look like in my life? In humans, that there's really this kind of the saying, right? Moderation is everything. You can always have too much of a good thing, or too little, right? And so you really want to have just the right amount, because if all the glucose is not needed, so let's say you're just sugar, 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 um, then that gets transformed. Okay, we'll think about a learning target here. It gets transformed into lipids, which is also just carbon and hydrogens rearranged with oxygen, sorry, rearranged, and then so stored as fat, and layers and layers and layers of fat. So you think about consuming too much sugar, it gets transformed into fat, and some of it will also be transformed into glycogen, which we'll talk about here in a moment as well. Okay, so overview on glucose and how it interacts with the body. Very important to understand. Then we have complex sugars. So complex sugars are technically, you can refer to them as polysaccharides, which just means many saccharides. And so as an overview, we have starch, cellulose, and glycogen. So I gave just a little couple bullet points on each one and an image to look at. Starch is the primary energy storage of green plants. Okay, so when we think about plants, plants do all of this too. Plants need glucose as well. Now they do it completely different, and they get it completely different. And I told us we're going to focus on kind of the human experience a little bit, so that it connects with you. But with plants, right, they're going to go through photosynthesis, and they're going to take nutrients like carbon and hydrogen and oxygen from either the soil or the air. And then the solar energy helps them rearrange the bonds, where they can then create these starch compounds and molecules. Okay. But with humans now, this is the most common carbohydrate in the human diet. So when we think about kind of this chart, we mentioned it, this is high in glucose like a potato, but it's not actually going to be in the form of glucose. That glucose is going to be in the form of starch, because it's going to be glucose attached to glucose attached to glucose. And so you get these large molecules in the form of starch that are just glucose added together. And it can be quite large and advanced. Uh, and so that is the most abundant carbohydrate that we will eat and consume. Then starchy foods are an important source of energy. And after they are eaten, they are broken down into glucose, which is the body's main fuel, especially for the brain and muscles. So our body then can take this large molecule of starch, and it can break each of these glucose molecules apart, and then it breaks the glucose apart further so that we can get the energy from that. So starch, you can imagine, has lots of energy that we can access. Then we have cellulose. So cellulose, again, this is not really pertaining to people, as you can maybe predict from the image here, but it is a reformation, again, of several hundred thousands of glucose units, very similar to starch, but you see how starch kind of has these off branches. Cellulose will be almost very specifically these straight strands, and kind of just a chain. But it is primarily and the most arguably important structural component of the cell wall for green plants, right? And so that's what this image is showing. We have these cell walls that are really formed from these chains of cellulose. So now the human experience, humans are unable, we're not able to break cellulose apart. So, we don't need to go too much into that, but I find it very interesting. This is, again, is just glucose, but the way that it is bonded together, which is different than how starch is bonded together, we are unable to break these bonds with our metabolism, and therefore we can't use these as energy. But cellulose is actually very important still to our diet, And we refer to it more commonly as, tried to highlight, fiber, which supports the digestive system and proper function of the intestinal tract. If you don't have enough fiber, uh, awkwardly enough, okay, you're going to have runny stool or diarrhea, right? So fiber really helps the digestive tract properly break food and reformat the food to make a good poop. So again, more commonly referred to as fiber and small cellulose. Actually, so this is kind of a side note. Small amounts of cellulose can be broken down to glucose, but only due to bacteria that can live in the gut. And dietitians, nutritionists, when they're researching this, they see that um, this bacteria tends to live in the gut if you consume uh, more vegetables. Okay, and we often refer to them maybe as probiotics. You might have heard that, and that really is, you can change what forms of bacteria are living in your gut based on the foods you consume. And they find that the healthier foods, Greek yogurt is one that's strongly connected to these probiotics, but fruits and vegetables are really connected to exposing your gut to these good bacteria. And we call them good bacteria because they help break down food even more. And so instead of having these foods not get broken down, and in some cases then transferred into fat, these bacteria that live in your gut will actually help break it down and be used as energy. So then there's less fat being stored. So the bacteria in your gut can actually directly link to how your body creates and stores fat. So super interesting. But again, that's a little bit of a side note. Now, glycogen. Nice big structure here. Okay, we have glycogen is a large and complex glucose structure. Again, when I said glucose was the most important one, you're hopefully seeing a pattern. It is, reused and used in plants and animals. So, complex glucose structure formed anytime any carbohydrates are consumed. So the body, other than cellulose, I should say, if the body needs to, it can take any of those forms of sugar and rearrange it to form the glucose. Because again, the only differences really are where some hydrogens and oxygens are placed, and so it can be rearranged into glucose. And then those glucose molecules, similar to starch, can be really these very complex, endless kind of globular complex, right? 30,000 glucose units. So very complex, very large. And it'll store this as uh, basically energy used for a later period of time. And this is much healthier than fat storage, right? So this is your body's getting the appropriate amount of carbohydrates, and it wants to store that energy so you can really use it throughout the day. And I believe if you don't have more food right within the day, then you've gone through your glycogen, and then that's when your body needs to use other sources. We're going to talk about that more later. Okay, so glycogen is created on a daily basis. If your diet is supporting that, and then it is then used for energy throughout the day. So glycogen is the main storage form of glucose in the body and is mostly stored primarily in the liver. And the reason for that is your blood flows through the liver, and then as your blood is flowing through the liver and your body needs more energy, it takes these glycogens and it breaks it apart into glucose super easily, and then it transports it through your bloodstream to your muscles, to your cells, and throughout your entire body. So the liver is the home for the most part, and small amounts can be stored in muscle tissue as well. So it's more immediate into your muscles. Um, Again, I just said most accessible form of quick energy, especially when food becomes unavailable. And that's for, again, just about a day. Because beyond that, it'll start transforming uh, to different forms of energy and trying to get different forms of energy. And there we go, bloodstream and fuel. Okay, humans consuming glycogen. So this is something that we can consume depending on what you're eating in this form. And our body, though, won't use it as glycogen immediately. So it, just like everything else that we consume, it'll metabolize the individual glucose, and then if it has to put the glucose units back together to form our own glycogen, it'll do that. So it's not the most efficient necessarily, but it uses the energy that it needs first. And then, just like always, it'll put it back together in the glycogen for our body. Okay, so those are kind of some of the important pieces and players, if you will, of the carbohydrate family. But I really wanted to make sure I focused our ideas on the four main functions of carbohydrates, and I really just mentioned them. But first, energy. Glucose can easily be converted to energy throughout the body. We don't need to know that energy kind of system. It's a little bit in the video, but that's really like a human anatomy and physiology class that would focus on the process of this. Um, then there's going to be energy storage, right? So it's making instant energy as you consume it, and then it'll store it as energy for later use, particularly in glycogen for animals. Here's what we didn't talk quite so much about. So it's also very important for the building of other biomolecules. And so carbohydrates all consist of carbons, hydrogens, oxygen. These atoms are also key building blocks to the other biomolecules. So, and we stated that in our last assignment, right? Um, and so this allows our body to break these bonds apart, rearrange them, and then excess carbons, excess hydrogens, oxygens can be used to form the protein amino acids. It can be form of lipids, which arguably is a good thing in some cases, could be probably not as good of a thing in some cases. But then nucleic acids, which again is our DNA. And if you recall the structure of our DNA, there is a glucose molecule in the center of it. So our DNA almost quite literally is a form of sugar. So there you go. That's why we love sugar so much, right? But nucleic acids. So they are the building blocks, and they can be rearranged and used in those forms as well. Then I kind of touched on this just a little bit, but it can, and this is kind of looking at it as a positive way, but there's also a negative twist, right? It can spare proteins and fats, and so let's say we're uh, an athlete, we're training for something. Okay, we don't want our well, most people don't want your muscles to be broken down and weakened. We want our muscles to be as strong as possible, so that we can walk without having sore muscles, right? We can lift whatever we need to lift, and that's going to be different for athletes or non-athletes and different things. But for the most part, no one wants to have sore, achy, weak feeling muscles. You want to feel like you can do what you want to do. So uh, what happens is when carbohydrates are consumed, they get used for energy first, right? We've talked about that. Now, if carbohydrates are not present through the digestion of food, your body will break down muscle tissue first. So I talked about glycogen is there, but if you go through that glycogen storage, now your body is like, oh, we need energy. And so it'll go and it will take energy from your muscles. It'll start breaking apart your muscles, quite literally, your proteins that form your muscles, because they're in the form of amino acids, and it'll take those bonds and break them apart for energy. So, um, really making sure you're consuming food while, especially if you're trying to build muscle or maintain muscle, is incredibly important. Uh, and eventually, and so this is where some nutritional and dietary concepts kind of come from. Eventually, your body will begin to break down lipids. So you might have heard of intermittent fasting, right? And that's really where it's kind of a newer thing over the last couple of years, but you're intentionally not eating for a certain range of time, and that forces your body through this process, so that your body then is forced to start breaking down fat cells for energy. And again, depending on what you're trying to do, this could work for you. But if you're an athlete, it really is not recommended because you're breaking down your muscles first. Your fat is the hardest thing to break down, and it's designed for long term storage, which we're usually refer to it as being stubborn, right? If we're trying to get rid of it, um, but again, it is carbons and hydrogen. So on the flip side, your body actually needs fat in some areas. So we need fat around our heart to help certain body functions and everything to be protected. So uh, it with any healthy person, that they need muscle tissue and fat, and so carbohydrates can act to spare that. That's why it's worded this way. So in turn, if carbohydrates are present, muscle tissue is preserved along with fat cells. And again, uh, that really is a positive thing if we're thinking about life, right? We cannot live without our muscle tissues and fat cells. So uh, that is the bit of information needed. You're going to go through a lot of it is reflecting, a lot of it's based on did you catch what you need to from the notes? And if you have questions, let me know in class.